Now let's continue with another diagram economists typically like. So that's the x1, x2 diagram. So x1 is good one, x2 is good two. So think of two different goods. And now scarcity kicks in. So the scarcity of resources now is in such a consumer theory household diagram is that consumers only have a certain budget, right? And the budget is denoted by Y, capital Y, to be more precise. And you can either spend your income for good one, which has the price P1. So these would be the expenditures for good one. Or you use your income to spend money for good two. So these are the expenditures for good two, right? So this is what we call the income constraint or the budget constraint, and this reflects the scarcity of resources of an household. So if the budget would be indefinite, we wouldn't have any economic problem. But reality tells us, well, we have a tight budget, right? So what we see then in such a diagram, this is the budget constraint. And how do we transfer this budget equation, the budget constraint, into a linear function? That needs some manipulation, right? Which is pretty easy, but you should have done that at least once. So what we do here, step one, we want to see an equation where x2 is on the left-hand side of the equation. And how do we isolate x2? Well, first we take P1, x1, P1, x1, and subtract P1, x1 from both sides of the equations. And if we subtract from the right side, then this part here disappears, and on the left side we have, now let's do it, y minus P1, x1, right? We subtract P1, x1 from both sides of the equation, and then we end up with y minus P1, x1 on the left-hand side of the equation. And on the right-hand side of the equation, we have P2, x2, right? So we are pretty close to our target. We want to isolate x2, that's our target, to draw the budget constraint in such a diagram. So what else is to do? Well, we see we have now divide by P2, and if you divide both sides of the equation by P2, we end up with y divided by P2 minus P1 x1 divided by P2, right? And we could rearrange it a little bit. So that's y over P2 minus P1 P2 times x1, and that's our linear function, which we could draw now here into this diagram. And we see that if x1 would be 0, so x1 would be 0, then this part disappears and we end up with y over P2 on the vertical axis, where this is this point, right? x1 is 0, 0 multiplied with P1 over P2 gives 0, this disappears, and we have only y over P2 on the vertical axis, right? And we see here that's the slope, and the slope is P1 over P2. Well, that's exactly what you should keep in mind. On the vertical axis, we have y over P2. And what you could do now in the assignment, we play around. We could increase y, we could decrease y, and you immediately see that then you shift around the budget constraint. If you decrease y, it goes down here. If you increase y, it goes up, right? And the slope is unchanged. On the other hand, if you play around with the budget constraint, you could change the slope, right? And the slope is P1 over P2. So if you increase P1, then the slope gets higher, meaning that here now the budget constraint gets steeper. If you do it the other way around, you decrease the price, then you would see that the slope is getting flatter, right? And if you increase P2, then once again it would get flatter, and if you decrease P2, then this would get steeper. So two kinds of variations. On the one hand, you change the budget constraint, which leads to shifts after budget constraint, a budget line to be more precise. And on the other hand, you can change the relative prices of these two goods, right? And then you have a slope rotation of the budget constraint. So the assignment will be about playing around here with the diagram, and you should get a little bit familiar with that because this is one of the most important tools of economists. For our purposes, we do not need any derivatives or so, right? So, but we should be really familiar with playing around with the graphic exposition of the budget constraint, with playing around with the diagram, shifting, rotating, and so on. And then we get a better understanding of what economists are really doing. Okay, fine?